Hello, somebody asked for some examples of how to use Airpress to update records and create records. So I'm going to do a quick walkthrough of a couple of ways to do that. We're going to use the restaurant field guide. This should look mostly like yours. I've made some changes to some of the districts, but that shouldn't matter. I'm going to try and update any restaurants, any burger restaurants, or any restaurants that belong to the burgers cuisine. And we're going to say that we visited it, and we'll update the reservation to yesterday, and say that we visited it yesterday. And so I just want a script that will do that, and then also we'll create a new restaurant in here. So we're going to jump over to WordPress. The easiest way to run some arbitrary code in WordPress, I feel like the most straightforward way, is just to create a page. So the page slug is update-create. And so in my text editor, when I'm editing my theme called Childish, it's a child theme. Yeah. I created page-update-create. So now whatever I put in here, it will run when I attempt to load this page, update, create, hit reload, and sure enough, it says hi. Fantastic. So now we can run some code. I already have Airpress configured in this WordPress install. So I have a connection default and another connection called new connection. So this would be 0 and this would be 1, and the name is default and the name is new configuration. So that will come into play here momentarily. So let's jump into some code. So the first thing we need to do, or the first thing I think we should do, is just query the cuisines table so that we can get a list of restaurants. Again, the way Airtable API works is I can't query the restaurants table and ask for tables where burgers are in the cuisine column, because I can't, it doesn't let you search within a column in a request. Instead, you have to make a request of the cuisines table and get the burgers record, which you can do. You can say where name equals burgers. Then once I get these values back, I can then populate a collection of records based on the IDs, the record IDs that are provided here. And so that would give me my restaurants. So what that looks like is, first we have to, I like to define the configuration I'm using. And so I do that this way. You don't have to use a global or a constant, I mean, or you can do this. So we have default as the name or 0 as the ID. However you want to do it, it will work fine. We then create a new query, and I'm going to provide a filter by formula here. So the Airpress query, it expects the table name and then a config ID or the config name. So it can be a string or an integer. So typically 0, if you're just doing a test install, will be the first one, and that will work fine. So I can do this, or I can do the ID or the name, and then the table name. And so spaces work in here if your table name has spaces. You don't have to worry about that. So now that we have our query, we're going to modify the query. So we have query filter by formula. We could have also done add filter. And so that's a good way to add multiple filters. They just stack up using the and method that Airtable provides. So now that we have our filter, we're expecting to get all the cuisines that have the name burger. So we're really only expecting one cuisine, but that's fine. So now let's go ahead and run our query and get a collection out of that. So cuisines is now holding a new Airpress collection that was generated by this query. So it's going to be a list of cuisines, which we know only has a single item in it. But after all, we weren't after the cuisines necessarily. We're after the restaurants. And so we want to actually populate a related field. And so we're just going to tell it to do that. And so populate related field expects to be run on a collection first of all. So we'll Airpress collection. We'll just do that. And then populate related field, and then the column name of the table that we're currently working with, so the local or the left table, and then or the column in the local or left table, and then the related table name that it links to. So in this case, we have restaurants and restaurants. So if we look back at Airtable, we can see that when we're in the cuisines table, we have a column named restaurants, and that links to the table called restaurants. So restaurants, the column, links to restaurants, the table. And yeah, so in the Airpress API, we just specify the column name and then the related table name. All right, so now that we've populated that, it actually went through and it got all the record IDs that were contained in this field here. And so each one of these records that links back to the restaurants table has its own record ID. And so it grabbed that array of record IDs, and then it constructed a new query in the background behind the scenes that said, get me records from the restaurants table where record ID equals da 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 da. So in essence, it just populated the related fields. So now cuisines has everything we wanted in it, or it has all the restaurants we wanted. So we can access those like this. So we only wanted a single cuisine, so we're getting the first record in the cuisines collection. And so populate related field is a recursive function, so it will go through every record in cuisines. So if we happened to not specify this, it would have fetched and populated every restaurant for every cuisine. So that'd be quite the fat little object there, collection. But since we only have one, it's only fetching a couple of restaurants, and so we're going to say, all right, now let's deal with those restaurants. So cuisines 0, so burgers cuisine, give us the restaurants column, which, because we populated the related field right here, it's actually a collection. And so now we have burger joints, which is a Airpress collection, just like cuisines was. But instead of a collection of cuisines, it's a collection of restaurants. So now we can iterate through that and do whatever we want. So if we were to do something like this, we can actually see if not is Airpress empty, burger joints. So that checks that it's an Airpress collection and it's not empty. And that way we won't get errors when we try to iterate through it. Then we're gonna loop through burger joints as restaurant. So now we can do something to each restaurant. The goal of looping through this is we're gonna check some condition and then update some fields. And so I'm gonna start off by saying fields to update is an empty array, because maybe we won't update a field on each restaurant there. So that's fine. So now our condition that we're going to look at is, let's say, if the restaurant status does not equal visited. So if this is a burger, if this is a restaurant that has the cuisine of burgers and the status does not equal visited, then we want to update it. As a side note, there is a way up here, when we populated the related field, we could have actually provided a query to only return or only populate the restaurants field with restaurants where the status did not equal visited. That's a bit more advanced, but it's, as you can tell, more efficient. So maybe I'll come back to that at the end of the video and show that. But as it is, we got all the restaurants that belong to burgers, and now we're looping through. And if this burger restaurant does not have a status of visited, then we want to change that status to visited in our example here. So we're going to say fields to update, status equals visited, and then we'll also change the reservation on to yesterday, because maybe that's when we went out and did our binge burger tour. So C sets the date to the ISO 18 something something. Date times can be confusing, but that's outside the scope of this video, sorry. This is just showing that it will work, and if your date time is configured properly on your server and you're in the same time zone, and it should play somewhat nicely. So now that we have, we've identified this as something we want to update, now we can do the update. So If fields to update is not empty, then we want to do the update. If it is empty, then clearly this wasn't a restaurant we needed to update, and so we don't want to update every single record. So we're just going to say restaurant, which is the record. It's an Airpress record, and then update, which is a method, and then the fields to update. And so it's just going to take whatever fields are in there and tell Airtable to update those fields on that record. So that's pretty straightforward for that portion. So shall we run that and see how that goes? There's no output being generated at this point, so that's fine. We won't worry about that. So we're going to look at, let's find some burger. So right here, 3 Parkside, the Parkside, that's nice, has a reservation made, and that should change to visited, and this date should change to the 22nd. And so let's load this page here and see what happens. Oh, there we go. So visited, and because it's using my API key, it's showing that I changed that record. And so you can see here in the history that Chester McLaughlin updated via the API all those fields. So yeah, that worked great. We updated a couple of records and we're good to go. So let's move on to create. So if we're going to create a record, we want to, there's 2 different ways. One is we could start with the collection that we have. So we have a collection of restaurants called burger joints here. And so we could use that burger joints as our starting point for creating the record. And so let's go ahead and do that. So it's not terribly complicated. So here's our lines to do that. So I note here that cuisine is provided as an array. So if you're going to create a record, we want to assign it to a cuisine. And so if we created a record in here, we'd give it a name and we'd select a cuisine from the drop down here. Even if it's you only allow a single related item, this is stored as an array. And so that's all that comment is pointing out, is that as we're writing this code, it's easy to say the new burger joint array has a name of Fat Joe's Famous Burger Joint and a cuisine of an array, and then we just grab the record ID from the first cuisine in our collection, which we know is going to be the burger cuisine. So now we have the burger cuisine record ID, and we don't have to give it any other fields to identify it. In fact, we can't. It has to be a record ID to make it a related field on create or update. So that's our burger joint array. So we say new burger joint record equals burger joints, which is an Airpress collection, and create record, and we just feed it in our array of values. We could have just done array name equals and then the name, but it wouldn't have a cuisine, and so I wanted to show how the cuisine works by feeding it a record ID. And so then it'll give us some output. So let's go ahead and try that. There we go. So we have the record ID and we have the name. And so if we go over to Airtable, sure enough, there's the record and it is in the right cuisine column. All right, so the second way to do this, if we don't want to start with a collection, say we didn't do the query up here, we didn't populate it, we didn't have all of these things, we didn't have a burger joints collection to start from, that's okay. We can kind of bootstrap the process here, and I'll show you how. So we're going to start again with the burger joint data. Sorry, the burger joint array, which is the same one that we had up here, which just gives it the values that we want. But instead, we're going to go directly into Airpress Connect. And Airpress Connect has a method called create that we can access. And we still need to feed it a config ID, because remember, that has your app ID and your API ID. And that's how it's going to connect. And it's going to need... because we're not creating a query yet, and so we still need to provide some configuration here so that we can create a query. We provide the table name that we want to connect to, and so this actually reaches out and it does create a record, but what it returns is just an array. and that array is basically the raw JSON output that Airtable feeds back, and it converts that, does JSON decode with the array flag to true, so that this is an array of the return data from connecting. So essentially, if you wanted the shortest possible command to create an Airtable record, this is it right here. You just need config ID, which might be 0 if that's your first configuration, or default as a string, and then the table name where you want to create the record, and then an array of fields with field or column name, field name, and then the value. So if we want to then use that in the Airpress universe, we need to do a little bit more in order to be able to do stuff with it. I create a query that's essentially just saying the same thing that we did up here. I want a query that is from the restaurants table and the config ID, and then I want a new collection, and I'm setting the second attribute to false, and that means don't actually run the query. So give me a collection, create it, store the query and the variables inside of it, but now we just have an empty new collection that is connected to the restaurants table, and we know that the query was basically get me all the restaurants. We then are going to set the records manually in this collection by feeding it an array of, they're not records yet, but they're the data for the records. And so we feed it in the new burger joint data as an array. And so it will be a collection of one item of one record. So here's our new burger joint record, just like we called it up here, but it's the new collection 0. It's the first record in there, and then we can echo it out. So this may seem counterintuitive, but there are times when it feels like it makes more sense to, instead of querying a collection and then creating something in that collection, sometimes you just want to create an item and then convert it into something, bootstrap your own collection with that as the item and not really running the query. And the reason why you want the query is if you're going to populate related records, it needs to know what table it was from. And it's, so that's just what you got to do. So let's run that now, and we should be creating two of the same burger joints and seeing output, both with different record IDs though. Sure enough, so we created 2 Fat Joe's Famous Burger Joints, different record ID on each one, and we can see our results here. We've now created 3. Look at that, every time, because it's in burgers, it's going to update the past 2. So if I run it again, it is going to update these 2 with visited. Perfect. Perfect. I'm glad this happened. Okay, so Airpress is primarily created to fetch and display data. It's optimized for that, and so the caching, it prevented these records from being seen, and so it prevented them from being, it made it so they couldn't be updated, because our query up here, where we said, please get me, it was when we populated the burger joints, populate related field restaurants. This gets cached, and so this request has been cached using the cache configuration that we have here, and so it's fairly quick, but still it cached. So if we hit reload now, there we go. So now the cache it cleared. But if I run it again right now, it's not going to hit these because it's still cached. It's just going to create more. So I could say up here, fresh equals true, and that will make sure that it ignores the cache settings and just gets everything. Or instead of running fresh equals true, I can actually code that in so that in my query, I can set the cache. You can do it like this, query set to expire, or you can actually chain the methods here. So query filter by formula set to expire after 0. I think this is clear for these intents and purposes. So now, regardless of how quickly I run this, oops, we're still fresh equals true. All right, so we'll run it again, and we will see that, all right, we created 2, and then we'll just run it one more time. And even though we're still within the cache time, it just overrides it and says, nope, we're going to do it. And so every time I run this, it is going to be sure to fetch the records fresh from the API. Cool, so that was a good example of how caching can be an issue when creating and updating records. You have to be sure to fetch the freshest records if you want to do any logic to discover if you want to create records or do any logic on updating records. You could update a field, and then if you do another fetch on it, it could fetch the cached version of that. And so that would definitely be a problem. So cool. I hope that helps you see how to create and update records. If you have any feedback, don't hesitate to reach out. The WordPress support forum is a great place for that. So go ahead and let me know if there's anything on there that you see, way to improve, or a use case that you're thinking of. There is a lot more in the works for Airpress moving forward. I think I'll be moving away from the virtual fields and virtual posts, which are oddly specific and yet very hard to configure. They're very general, open-ended configuration settings. And so I think I want to move towards having triggers and actions and predefined queries. So I think that's a huge step forward, but it'll also take a lot of work to refactor the administrative interface. So if you want to help, you can always head over to wordpress.org/plugin/Airpress and click on the donate to this plugin button, which would definitely help me free up time in my schedule to improve Airpress. But in the meantime, I hope you are finding a lot of value in using the plugin, and don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks so much.